Hey, I'm Amelia Mosley, and today we're exploring the history of Anzac Day. Here's what's coming up. We find out the story behind the last post, what life was like in the trenches, and the role animals have played in conflicts. First up in our Anzac Day special, we're going to find out exactly what happened on the beaches of Gallipoli way back in 1915. Here's Match to explain.
We are on the battlefield, well under the fire of the enemy.
This was the first casualty, and very soon there were several others hit.
Then the order was given to fix bayonets and drive the Turks out, which we did with a vengeance.
This was the landing at Gallipoli on April 25th, 1915, as described by some of the men that lived through it. More than 50,000 Australian troops fought here, and 8,000 of them died here too. But Gallipoli was just one small part of a much bigger conflict. What's now known as the First World War began in 1914 between these two powerful groups. Australia was still a member of the British Empire, and many young Aussies saw it as a chance to sign up and serve their country.
I was keen, 100% keen, like we all were in those days.
By November 1914, a force of 20,000 Australian men had arrived in Egypt, ready to fight. Most of the fighting was taking place here, on the Western Front in France. But months in, neither side was winning. So Britain came up with a plan to defeat Germany by attacking its allies, Austria, Hungary, and what's now Turkey. Their goal was to take control of this area, called the Dardanelles. Ground forces were sent in at 3 main points. Many were actually British and French. Australians and New Zealanders made up just one of the landings, at a place we now know as Anzac Cove.
When she hit the beach, I gave the word to get out, and out the men got at once, into the water, up to their necks.
In darkness, they faced a tough and difficult climb up the beach, while from above, Turkish soldiers and artillery fired on them. Both sides dug trenches for cover.
The place was a quarter in the bursting shells, you know.
For months, the fighting continued, neither side getting an advantage over the other, though several attempts were made. One of those was the Battle of Lone Pine. The Aussies created a diversion by attacking Turkey's front lines, then held their position despite intense fighting. 7 Australians won the Victoria Cross here, the highest award for bravery in wartime. But while the Australian attack was successful, the overall Allied mission failed. By December, the Allies gave up on taking Gallipoli and started planning an evacuation instead. To help, one Aussie soldier came up with this invention, a gun that would go off on its own using weighted cans of water. The drip rifle helped hold off any attacks, while the Anzacs withdrew.
We thought we'd be very lucky if we got away.
But they did. And after 8 long months, the Gallipoli campaign was finally over. World War I stretched on for another 3 years. And during that time, on the Western Front, the Anzacs would fight many more battles and lose many more lives than they did at Gallipoli. But they'd also have a much bigger impact, which eventually helped the Allies go on to win the war in 1918. Gallipoli wasn't the most important battle Australia was involved in during World War I, but it's still remembered as the first real battle we took part in as a nation. And every year since, on April 25th, people around the country commemorate those who fought and died there.
One of the most moving parts of any dawn service is the last post, played on a bugle. But why is that particular piece of music always played? Let's find out.
Jordan has a big job to do on Anzac Day, playing the last post at a commemorative service.
The Last Post is a beautiful piece of music. It's not exactly easy to play, but after a bit of practice you get there and it sounds really nice.
The Last Post is a military call that was originally used by British troops in the 17th century. The Reveille, the first call, was used to signal the start of a soldier's day. And the Last Post signalled its end.
Now we use it as a way of paying our respect to all of the soldiers who lost their lives in World War I and II and all the other conflicts.
And it's played on this instrument, a bugle. So what is a bugle?
A bugle is pretty much like a trumpet, except it doesn't have any valves. And it only has a set amount of tubing, so it can only play a couple notes.
But lately, there haven't been enough buglers like Jordan to play at all the dawn services. So veterans groups are giving free bugles to some schools to try and encourage more kids to play. For Jordan, it's much more than playing an instrument.
I have a lot of family members who've been in wars. My dad's also been to Afghanistan. I like to think of it as a way of showing respect for not only my dad, but also my grandfathers and great-grandfathers who lost their lives in the war.
Did you know weapons weren't actually the biggest killer at Gallipoli? More Aussie troops died of disease while living in the trenches than they did fighting. Let's see what life in the trenches was really like.
Boys, as young as 14, found themselves in the middle of a war. Some faked their age or stowed away on ships. And many, like 14-year-old Australian James Martin, never returned. But what was life like for them and the other soldiers who served in World War I? Well, the Warradale 43 Army Cadet Unit went to find out. They visited the Army Museum of South Australia to look at one of the many exhibitions around the country that give us a glimpse into life during World War I.
This is the amber boxes back then.
First up, they looked at the equipment Australian soldiers had to work with. The troops were meant to have a woolen tunic and breeches, puttees, which are a strip of cloth wrapped around the lower leg for protection and support, 100 rounds of ammunition, a rifle, a bayonet, a water bottle, a trench tool to dig their new homes, kindling for small fires, food rations, and a pack. But many soldiers weren't properly equipped. And as the campaign dragged on, the uniforms started to change as they tried to adapt to hot and cold conditions. Okay, so what about where the troops slept? In places like Gallipoli, you were expected to basically dig out your own room in the side of trenches.
The best trenches had small buildings like radio rooms built into them. They were covered or reinforced with wood and corrugated iron. But even these better trenches were still pretty squishy for our troops.
Okay, but surely they must have had some decent food, right? Well, not quite. An average meal after a tough day in the trenches looked a bit like this. Some cheese, perhaps an onion, maybe some jam, tea, and this very hard biscuit known as hard tack or the Anzac tile. The highlight was some bully beef or tinned corned beef. It's edible, but that's about it. Not enough food, dirty clothes, and horrible living conditions often led to disease. Diseases alone are thought to have killed more than 2 million people in the First World War. Even for these guys, seeing how the Anzac soldiers lived was pretty shocking.
They were actually living really, really harshly, that a lot of the elements were against them and the odds for them surviving the war were pretty low.
But it gives us an idea of some of the things our troops sacrificed for all Australians.
Next up, we're going to hear from some kids who have been learning more about how their culture was involved in Gallipoli. They'll give you the Turkish perspective on World War I that we don't always hear that much about. Take a look.
Turkish culture is really important to Evan and his cousin Elena. They, along with their families, often cook big Turkish feasts, and they speak Turkish at home too.
13 tane.
They're some of more than 100,000 Australians whose families originally came from Turkey. But while Evan knows a lot about the culture of Turkey, he wishes he knew more about what happened to Turkish soldiers during World War I.
I started to do some reading, and I went to the library in my school and I saw this Turkish book.
What Australians know as the Gallipoli campaign is known by Turkish people as the Battle of Çanakkale. Although the country wasn't called Turkey back then, it was actually part of the Ottoman Empire. In World War I, it was on the same side as countries like Germany and Austria-Hungary.
This is me.
Ada is another Turkish-Australian kid who's interested in both sides of the Gallipoli story. Her great-great-uncle was actually there.
My great-uncle is Halil Ibrahim. He fought in Gallipoli in his early 20s and died there, and because he didn't really want to lose another part of his country.
Turkey was expecting to be attacked, but it didn't know where or when. So when the Anzacs landed at Gallipoli, Turkish forces fought back and they quickly called for reinforcements.
I think that when the Anzacs came to Gallipoli, the Turkish had a big shock, and it would have been scary because they weren't prepared for it.
Most of the Turkish soldiers had never heard of Australia or New Zealand before. Many came from poor rural backgrounds and they hadn't had the chance to go to school. They were led by determined commanders like this man, Colonel Mustafa Kemal. Ada, Evan and Elena all like hearing about the camaraderie that went on between some Aussie and Turkish soldiers. As these diary entries show,
extraordinary friendly exchanges between the Turks and our fellows this morning early. Some of our chaps ran right over to the enemy trenches and exchanged bully, jam, cigarettes, etc.
And some Anzacs even left farewell notes for the Turks when they left.
Most of the lads left notes behind thanking Abdul for the use of the ground, also for the fair fight they'd given us, and assuring them that any of the food left behind had not been poisoned, but was actually quite good.
After 8 months of fighting, the Turkish forces won, although in the end they'd be on the losing side of World War I. But despite that, the battle at Gallipoli was considered one of their greatest victories, and it helped build a sense of pride and identity among the Turkish people. After the war, the Turkish commander at Gallipoli went on to become the country's first president, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. And in 1934, he's said to have written this tribute to the Anzacs killed at Gallipoli.
Those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives, you are now lying in the soul of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmeds. To us, where they lie side by side here in this country of ours.
The continuing friendship between Turkey and Australia is something Evan and Elena want to recognise. So they're donning traditional outfits and representing Turkey at an Anzac Day vigil.
If the Turkish didn't like the Australians, we wouldn't be here right now, and we wouldn't have the friends that we would have.
Animals played a really important role during the fighting at Gallipoli, saving lives and being loyal companions. Let's learn more about how they served.
It might look like a zoo, But these pictures come from the middle of war zones. Many of the Anzac soldiers had animal companions. It's estimated more than 136,000 Australian horses were sent to World War I. The horses, along with donkeys and camels, helped carry heavy loads and soldiers. Smaller animals like pigeons carried notes that often contained life-saving information. Dogs also carried messages, and they could sniff out explosives or fallen soldiers. They even had their own equipment. Animals were so successful in World War I, they've been used in most wars since. And for their bravery and service, pigeons, dogs and horses have even received war medals. The Dickon Medal is the animal equivalent of the Victoria Cross for bravery. Even a cat named Simon got one after World War II for guarding a ship's food supplies from rats. Whether as war heroes or just as friends, animals have always stood alongside our troops, as they still do today.
And that's all for this BTN Anzac special. For more info on all of our specials, including heaps of teacher resources, just head to our website. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye.